The air inside the vault was pressurized and tasted of ozone. Alara's fingers, encased in thin tactile silk, hovered over the tumblers of the unbreakable Thorn Mark IV. One more click and the ledger, the only evidence of her brother's innocence, would be hers. Click. The heavy steel door didn't swing open. Instead, the floor-to-ceiling mirrors in the hallway behind her dissolved into a series of high-definition screens. I expected better from a legend. A low, resonant scrape of a voice vibrated through the small chamber. Alara froze. She didn't turn around. She knew that voice. It was the voice that had demanded her schedule every morning for 3 years. But it wasn't the voice of her boss. It was the voice of a man who had finally trapped his white whale. "Julian," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread of silk. "Mr. Thorne to you, Alara," he replied. A heavy hand landed on her shoulder, spinning her around. The silver-tongued pleasantries of the office were gone. Julian stood before her in his tuxedo, his gray eyes burning with an intense, forward-facing fury. His hand reached for her silver mask, his fingers brushing against her soft skin with a heat that made her skin feel on fire. "I've spent 3 years wondering why my assistant was always so tired," he whispered, his face inches from hers, his posture one of absolute, quiet dominance. "I didn't realize you were spending your nights trying to break into my heart and my hardware." He gripped the edge of her mask. "Now, let's see the face of the woman I'm going to send to prison." Just as his fingers hooked under the silver filigree, the lights didn't just flicker, they died. The penthouse groaned as the emergency shutters slammed shut with a series of thunderous, metallic bangs. Red emergency strobes began to pulse, painting the room in the color of a fresh wound. "Julian." Alara's voice was no longer timid. It was sharp, cold, and calculated. "Those aren't your security protocols." From the other side of the vault door, the muffled, rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire echoed through the vents. "The Volkov hit team," Julian hissed, his grip on her shoulder shifting from a capture to a protective anchor. He pulled her back against his chest, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist. "They didn't come for the ledger. They came for the ghost." And the man holding her. Alara looked up at him, the fear in her eyes replaced by a lethal confidence that mirrored his own. "Then I suggest you don't unmask me yet, Mr. Thorne. You're going to need a thief to get out of this building alive." The fluorescent lights of the Thorne security headquarters hummed with a monotonous, soul-crushing rhythm that Alara Vance had learned to use as a metronome for her deception. She adjusted her thick-rimmed, non-prescription glasses and smoothed out the wrinkles in her deliberately frumpy, mustard-colored cardigan. To the hundreds of employees bustling through the glass corridors, she was just the assistant, the one who tripped over her own feet in the break room and apologized to the copier when it jammed. She walked toward Julian's office, her arms laden with a stack of quarterly reports and a perfectly temperature-controlled espresso. She moved with a practiced, shuffling gait, hiding the liquid grace that, only 6 hours ago, had allowed her to scale a vertical glass wall in the rain. "You're 3 minutes late, Alara." Julian's voice drifted over his mahogany desk, a low, resonant scrape that made the fine hairs on her neck stand up. He didn't look up from his monitors. He sat in his shirt sleeves, the fabric straining against his broad shoulders, his dark hair reflecting the clinical blue light of a dozen security feeds. He was the hunter, a man obsessed with a phantom he couldn't catch, unaware that she was currently placing a saucer on his desk with a trembling hand. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne. The elevator, it made a funny noise and I got a bit flustered," she stammered, offering a shy, vulnerable look that she had perfected in the mirror. Julian finally turned his gaze toward her. His intense, forward-facing stare was like a physical weight, a piercing gray that seemed to be looking for a crack in her mask. For a heartbeat, Alara wondered if he could hear her heart hammering against her ribs. She wondered if he could smell the faint scent of rooftop ozone that lingered beneath her floral perfume. "You're always flustered, Alara," he remarked, his voice dropping to a tone of quiet dominance. He stood up, his height looming over her, the faint scar on his eyebrow twitching. "You have the mind of a strategist and the coordination of a newborn fawn. It's a fascinating contradiction." He stepped closer, reaching out to take the reports. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, accidental contact that sent a dangerous thrill through her system. Alara instinctively lowered her head, hiding her expressive eyes behind the glare of her lenses. I just try my best, sir," she whispered. "Your best is why I keep you around," Julian said, his gaze lingering on her just a second too long. "But tonight, I need you to be more than a shadow. The masquerade is the biggest security launch of the year. I can't have you tripping over the dignitaries. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. I'll stay out of the way. Like a ghost," she replied, the irony tasting like copper in her mouth. Julian turned back to his screens, his mind already returning to his hunt for the thief who had been mocking his systems for years. "Exactly. Because tonight, I'm finally closing the net. I'm going to catch her, Alara. And when I do, I'm going to make sure she never sees the light of day again." Alara retreated from the office, her clumsy persona firmly back in place until the door clicked shut. As she walked past the security team, she didn't look like a threat. She looked like a girl who couldn't handle a paper cut. But as she adjusted her glasses, her eyes were no longer shy. They were calculating, sharp, and lethal. The hunter was ready for his prize, but the ghost was already inside the house. The grand ballroom of the Thorn estate was a cavernous theater of gold leaf and velvet, illuminated by 1,000 flickering candles that did nothing to warm the cold blue security beams sweeping secretly above the crown molding. This was Julian's world, a high society fortress where every guest was a potential target and every smile was a mask. Alara adjusted the obsidian silk of her gown, feeling the weight of the silver filigree mask against her skin. Gone were the thick glasses and the mustard cardigan. In their place was a woman of liquid grace, her spine straight and her expressive eyes reflecting the lethal confidence of a predator. She moved through the crowd like a breath of smoke, avoiding the high-intensity gaze of the man at the center of the room. Julian stood on the mezzanine, a pillar of quiet strength in a charcoal tuxedo. He didn't wear a mask. His face was a shield enough. His gray eyes scanned the ballroom not for friends, but for a glitch in the pattern, a movement too smooth, a shadow too still. He was the hunter, and tonight, the air tasted of the kill. "May I have this dance, Alara?" The voice vibrated against her spine. She froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. He shouldn't have recognized her. She was the ghost tonight, not the assistant. She turned slowly, her silk skirts whispering against the marble. "I believe you have me mistaken for someone else, Mr. Thorn," she said, her voice a low, melodic thread, stripped of its usual stammer. Julian didn't blink. He stepped into her personal space, his presence an absolute anchor that made the rest of the gala fade into a blurred tapestry of red and gold. "I know that scent," he whispered, his hand finding the small of her back and drawing her firmly toward him. "Violets and rooftop rain. You can change your clothes, Alara, but you can't change your pulse." The music swelled, a dark, haunting waltz. Julian led her onto the floor, his movements possessing a disciplined power that forced her to follow. As they spun, his arm wrapped around her waist, not in a romantic gesture, but as a cage. Every pass was a test, every turn was a probe. "You're remarkably light on your feet for a girl who trips over carpets," he murmured, his gaze intense and forward-facing, locked onto hers. "Where did you learn to move like that?" "The shadows. I've spent a lot of time watching you, Julian," she countered, the dangerous thrill of the truth making her skin feel on fire. "You'd be surprised what a shadow notices when the light is too busy looking elsewhere." The dance was a high-stakes interrogation. She could feel the lethal confidence radiating from him, a silent promise that he was seconds away from tearing the silver mask from her face. But Alara didn't pull away. She leaned into the heat, her grip on his shoulder tightening instinctively. "You're trembling," he noted, his thumb brushing the silk at her waist. "Is it fear, or are you just excited for the end of the game?" "Maybe I'm just wondering what happens when the hunter realizes he's been dancing with the prize all along," she whispered. Before he could answer, a sharp, electronic chirp echoed from the earpiece hidden beneath his dark hair. His posture shifted instantly, The hunter was back on the clock. He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a low, resonant scrape. Stay here. Don't move. My sensors just picked up a breach at the vault. He turned to leave, but Alara caught his sleeve, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and warning. Julian, wait. I told you, Alara, he said, his gaze as hard as slate. Tonight, the ghost ends. As he disappeared into the crowd, Alara didn't stay put. She moved in the opposite direction, toward the service stairs. The waltz was over. The heist had begun. The heavy steel doors of the vault room hissed shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. Inside, the only light came from the cold blue glow of the laser grid reflecting off the silver filigree of Alara's mask. She had her hands inside the Thornmark IV, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She was seconds away from the ledger when the overhead lights died, replaced by the rhythmic, visceral throb of red emergency strobes. I told you to stay in the ballroom, Alara. The voice didn't come from the intercom. Julian was standing in the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the crimson light. He didn't have a weapon drawn. His lethal confidence was a weapon in itself. He walked toward her, each footfall echoing with quiet dominance. Julian, you don't understand, she started, her voice no longer the timid assistance but the sharp, desperate tone of the ghost. I understand everything, he rasped, pinning her against the vault door. His hand didn't go for the gun at his hip, it went for her throat, his thumb pressing against her racing pulse. I understand that the woman who makes my coffee by day is the same thief who's been mocking my legacy by night. I should break you right here. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes burning with an intense, forward-facing fury. But as his fingers hooked under the edge of her mask to finally end the deception, the building shuddered. A massive explosion from the floors below rattled the vault, throwing them both against the steel. A mechanical voice filled the room. Full lockdown initiated. External breach detected. All exits sealed. That wasn't me, Alara hissed, her grip on Julian's tuxedo jacket tightening instinctively as she looked at the monitors. The security feeds showed black-clad mercenaries, not Julian's men, moving through the gala with suppressed rifles. They weren't arresting the guests. They were systematic. They were butchers. The Volkov Syndicate, Julian breathed, his protective instinct overriding his rage. He shoved Alara behind him, his arm wrapping firmly around her as he scanned the room. They didn't come for the vault. They came to decapitate the Thorn Empire while the ghost was the distraction. They've jammed the lifts and the stairs, Alara said, her eyes calculating escape routes. We're 40 floors up and trapped in a steel box. Julian turned to her, his gaze as hard as the vault behind them. The hunter and the ghost were no longer alone. They were the only two variables left in a building that had become a vertical graveyard. You want to prove you're more than a thief? Julian asked, his voice a low, resonant scrape of a challenge. Then stop trembling. We have 12 minutes before they reach this floor, and I'm the only one with the codes to the service ducts. And I'm the only one small enough to climb them and manual override the locks, Alara countered, her expressive eyes flashing with a sudden, quiet strength. Julian looked at her, the girl he'd underestimated for years, and saw the partner he had unknowingly been searching for. Then the game is on hold. For now, we survive. He grabbed a tactical sidearm from a hidden wall compartment and handed a combat knife to Alara. In the red pulse of the emergency lights, their shadows merged. The vault was a gilded cage no more. It was the starting line of a war. The service elevator shaft was a vertical abyss of grease-slicked cables and humming high-voltage wires, illuminated only by the intermittent, hellish flicker of the red emergency strobes. They stood on the narrow maintenance ledge, 40 floors of gravity tugging at their heels. Below them, the muffled thud-thud of suppressed gunfire echoed up the shaft. The Volkov hit squad was clearing the floor directly beneath them. The manual override is in the junction box 6 meters up, Julian gritted out, his teeth clenched against the pain of a shrapnel graze on his thigh. He looked at the distance, then at the heavy tactical gear weighing him down. I can't make that jump with this leg. We're trapped. I can, Alara said. Before he could protest, she shed the silk skirts of her gown, revealing the matte black tactical leggings she had hidden beneath. Gone was the timid assistant. She moved with a liquid, predatory grace that made Julian's breath hitch. She stepped to the very edge of the abyss, her expressive eyes locked on the rusted metal box above. "Alara, don't be a fool. If you slip, then the ghost finally disappears for real," she interrupted, throwing a wink over her shoulder that was pure, lethal confidence. She leaped. Julian watched, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the mercenaries. She didn't just jump, she flew. She caught a swaying cable, her body swinging with the momentum of a professional gymnast, and used the wall's friction to propel herself upward. In seconds, she was perched on the junction box like a gargoyle. "I'm in," she called down, her voice a low, melodic thread that cut through the mechanical hum. Julian watched her work, her fingers moving with the same precision he'd seen her use on his espresso machine, but with a terrifying speed. He had spent years hunting a phantom, imagining a hulking brute or a seasoned veteran. He hadn't expected this. A woman who was part art, part shadow, and entirely his equal. Lockdown bypassed. The computer chirped. With a heavy groan, the elevator doors above them slid open. Alara dropped back down, landing silently beside him. She was flushed, her skin glowing in the red light, her pulse visible in the hollow of her throat. Julian didn't move toward the door. He reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The lethal confidence of the hunter met the quiet strength of the thief. "You've been holding back on me, Miss Vance," he whispered, his voice a resonant scrape that sent a dangerous thrill through her system. "All those times you dropped your pen, you were just testing my reaction time, weren't you?" "Maybe," she breathed, her grip on his tuxedo jacket tightening. "Or maybe I just like seeing you pick things up for me." The heat between them was a distraction they couldn't afford, but in the heart of a vertical graveyard, it was the only thing that felt alive. Julian leaned in, his gaze intense and forward-facing. "When we get out of this, we are going to have a very long conversation about your salary." "And my partnership?" she challenged. "And your partnership." A heavy boom echoed from the floor below. The mercenaries had breached the shaft. Julian's expression hardened, the hunter returning to the surface. He checked his sidearm and looked at the open door above. "Move. We have 30 floors to go, and I'm not losing my best employee today." They found a temporary sanctuary in the mechanical room on the 28th floor, a cathedral of thrumming boilers and hissing steam pipes. The red emergency strobes cast long, jagged shadows against the industrial steel, creating a cold blue and crimson twilight. Julian slumped against a heavy iron pillar, his face pale as he worked to dress the graze on his thigh. Alara knelt before him, her hands steady as she took the medkit. In this dim, private space, the masks, both literal and figurative, felt like they were dissolving. She worked with a quiet strength, her fingers nimble as she cleaned the wound. "You're too good at that," Julian remarked, his voice a low, resonant scrape. He watched her intently, his gray eyes searching her face. "Where did a girl like you learn to patch up a gunshot wound in the dark?" Alara didn't look up. "The same place I learned to scale buildings. A place called St. Jude's Home for the Forgotten. After the fire 15 years ago, they didn't exactly teach us needlepoint. They taught us how to survive." Julian froze, his body tensing under her touch. "St. Jude's?" "That was the orphanage near the docks. It was a warehouse for kids with no names," Alara corrected, her expressive eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp grief. "I was there because my parents died in the Thorn Plaza collapse. The city called it an accident. I called it murder." The silence that followed was heavier than the steel surrounding them. Julian reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her wrist, stopping her movements. "My father died in that collapse, Alara. He was the chief engineer. The board blamed him for the structural failure to cover up their own greed. I've spent 15 years becoming a king just to find the men who falsified those reports." Alara looked up, her gaze meeting his intense, forward-facing stare. The dangerous thrill that had defined their dance was gone, replaced by a raw, shared vulnerability. I was stealing that ledger tonight because I thought your family held the evidence. I didn't realize we were hunting the same ghosts. The ledger isn't in the vault, Julian whispered, his thumb brushing the soft skin of her palm. It was never there. I used it as bait to draw out the ghost. I wanted the one person who could break into any system to help me crack the last encryption. He pulled her closer, his presence an absolute anchor in the shifting shadows. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a thief or an assistant. He was looking at the missing piece of his own history. The lethal confidence they both wore was a shield for the same scarred hearts. We were both orphans of the same lie, Julian said, his voice dropping to a melodic anchor. And now we're the only ones left who know the truth, Alara replied, her grip on his hand tightening. The moment was shattered by the screech of a metal saw cutting through the reinforced door at the far end of the room. The Volkovs had found the trail. Julian hauled Alara to her feet, his arm wrapping around her waist in a silent promise of protection. They think they're hunting a thief and a businessman, Julian hissed, his gray eyes turning to slate. They don't realize they've trapped two people with nothing left to lose. Let's show them what a ghost can do when she has something to fight for, Alara said, her lethal confidence returning with a vengeance. The mechanical room's steam pipes hissed like a choir of warning as the steel door finally buckled under the weight of a breaching charge. The red emergency strobes pulsed with a violent frequency, turning the room into a strobe-lit slaughterhouse. Julian didn't hesitate. He pulled Alara behind the heavy iron mass of a boiler, his presence an absolute anchor as the first spray of gunfire tore through the air where they had been standing seconds before. The service hatch in the ceiling, Julian commanded, his voice a low, resonant scrape that cut through the thunder of the room. It leads to the executive express lift. If we can reach it, we can bypass the next 10 floors. I need a diversion, Alara said, her expressive eyes scanning the room. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was calculating. The vulnerable assistant was dead. Julian looked at her, then at the volatile pressure valve on the main steam line. With a grim, lethal confidence, he fired a single, precise shot. The valve exploded, releasing a blinding, scalding curtain of white vapor that filled the chamber. Under the cover of the screaming steam, Alara moved like a shadow. She didn't just climb. She vanished into the rafters, her liquid grace allowing her to reach the hatch and kick it open. Julian. Now, he hauled himself up, his wounded leg protesting, but Alara's grip on his arm was instinctive and fierce. She pulled him into the narrow, cold blue, lit maintenance crawlspace. As they lay there, chests heaving in the cramped dark, the silence returned, but it was a silence charged with a new, dangerous heat. Julian reached out. His fingers didn't find her silk gown this time, but the cold, silver edge of her filigree mask. He didn't rip it away. He moved with a deliberate, quiet dominance, his gaze intense and forward-facing even in the shadows. The game is over, Alara. No more masks. No more ghosts. He slowly peeled the silver filigree back. The red strobe light from the hatch caught her face. The soft features he saw every morning, but without the glasses, without the timid slouch. Her eyes were wide, glowing with a mix of defiance and absolute trust. You're even more beautiful when you're not trying to be invisible, he whispered, his voice dropping to a melodic anchor. Alara didn't pull away. She leaned into the heat of his presence, the dangerous thrill of the night reaching a breaking point. I spent my whole life trying to be the girl no one noticed, Julian. It's terrifying to be seen by you. I've been seeing you for years, he countered, his thumb brushing her cheek. I just didn't realize I was looking at my equal. The moment was a fragile restoration of their shared history, but the building groaned beneath them. The mercenaries were using explosives on the lift cables. The floor shuddered, a reminder of the unseen enemies closing in. Julian leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. When we reach the roof, I'm going to finish what our parents started. But I need the ghost to get me through that door. The ghost is gone, she whispered, her lethal confidence flaring as she checked the combat knife at her hip. You're looking at Alara Vance. And she doesn't lose. The security hub of Thorn Tower was a cathedral of glass and humming server racks, bathed in a cold blue, digital twilight that felt light years away from the fire and blood of the lower floors. This was the brain of the Empire, a room Julian had designed to be an impenetrable fortress. To any other thief, the triple encrypted biometric locks would have been a death sentence. To Alara, it was a canvas. The hub is hardwired to the mainframe, Julian said, his voice a low, resonant scrape as he stood guard at the reinforced glass door, his sidearm leveled at the hallway. If you can't bypass the encryption in 90 seconds, the system will purge every file on the Thorn Plaza collapse. We'll lose the evidence forever. Alara stepped up to the primary console, her fingers dancing over the haptic interface with a liquid grace that made Julian's lethal confidence waver for a heartbeat. She wasn't just typing. She was communicating with the machine, her expressive eyes reflecting strings of cascading code. "I don't need 90 seconds, she murmured, her voice stripped of its timid office shell. "I built a backdoor into your firmware 18 months ago, Julian. Right under your nose." Julian let out a short, dry laugh, a sound of grim respect. "Remind me to never hire a genius as an assistant again." As she worked, the red emergency strobes outside the hub intensified. The rhythmic thud of a battering ram echoed through the corridor. The Volkovs were here. "Alara, hurry," Julian commanded, his posture shifting into a predatory crouch. "Almost there," she hissed. Her skin felt on fire as the final firewall flickered. "The system is asking for a dual-auth biometric. It needs the CEO and a secondary admin." Julian didn't hesitate. He stepped to the console, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist to pull her closer to the scanner. "I never authorized a secondary admin." "Check the files, Mr. Thorn," Alara whispered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I authorized myself 3 months ago." They pressed their hands onto the glass sensor simultaneously, his large, scarred hand over her smaller, steady one. The cold blue light turned to a brilliant, victorious gold. Asterisk, access granted. Files decrypted. Building defense systems, online. Asterisk. Got it. Alara breathed, her lethal confidence surging. She didn't just stop at the files. With a few sharp commands, she hijacked the building's internal speakers and light arrays. "Now, let's show them why it's a bad idea to hunt a ghost in her own house." Suddenly, the hallway outside erupted. The red strobes were replaced by a blinding, high-frequency white pulse designed to disorient, while the fire suppression system began to vent freezing nitrogen into the corridor. The mercenaries' screams were muffled by the sudden roar of the building's sirens. Julian looked at Alara, his gray eyes burning with an intense, forward-facing pride. "You didn't just break in. You took the keys." "I told you, Julian," she said, her grip on his hand tightening as they prepared for the final ascent. "I'm not a shadow anymore." But the victory was short-lived. A heavy, metallic clank echoed from the roof above. The executive helipad. Viktor Volkov wasn't waiting for his men to clear the path. He was coming down to claim the prize himself. The rooftop was a jagged landscape of steel and rain, a sky-high altar where the wind howled with the fury of 1,000 ghosts. The cold blue neon of the Thorn logo flickered erratically, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the helipad. Standing in the center of the downpour was Viktor Volkov, a man of monolithic cruelty, his silhouette framed by the blades of a waiting helicopter. Julian stepped onto the wet concrete, his movements heavy but possessed of a lethal confidence that refused to yield. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a god of war returning to the site of his father's murder. Beside him, Alara moved with a liquid grace, her obsidian gown tattered but her gaze as sharp as the combat knife in her hand. 15 years, Julian. Victor's voice was a guttural rasp that cut through the gale. He held a detonator in one hand and a heavy-caliber pistol in the other. "Your father died in the dirt. It's only fitting you die in the clouds." "The dirt was your lie, Victor," Julian replied, his voice a low, resonant scrape. He didn't look at the gun. He looked into the eyes of the monster. "We have the ledger. The city knows what you did to the Thorn Plaza. There's no shadow left for you to hide in." Victor laughed, a dry, hollow sound. Then I'll just have to make sure there's no one left to testify. He raised the weapon, but he hadn't accounted for the ghost. Alara didn't wait for the command. She sprinted toward the perimeter, her body a blur of speed and shadow. As Victor fired, she dropped into a low slide, the rain-slicked concrete carrying her beneath his line of sight. Julian used the distraction to close the gap. He was a pillar of quiet strength, absorbing a shoulder graze as he tackled Victor into the structural bracing of the helipad. The fight was a brutal, hand-to-hand symphony of shared scars and raw survival. Julian's fists were heavy, fueled by 15 years of suppressed rage, while Victor fought with the desperate, erratic violence of a cornered animal. Alara, the detonator. Julian roared as he pinned Victor's arm against the steel. Victor kicked out, sending Julian reeling toward the edge, but before he could thumb the switch, Alara was there. She didn't use her knife. She used the environment she had spent years mastering. She kicked a loose, pressurized canister toward Victor, and as he instinctively reached to swat it away, she lunged. Her grip on his wrist was instinctive and fierce. She didn't look like the vulnerable girl from the office. She looked like the justice the city had forgotten. With a sharp, tactical twist, she snapped his wrist, the detonator clattering into the abyss below. "That's for St. Jude's," she hissed. Julian recovered, stepping forward to deliver the final, crushing blow that sent Victor spiraling into the unconscious dark of the rooftop. The hunter had finally closed the net. The wind began to die down as the first rays of a gray, bruised dawn broke over the horizon. Julian slumped against the helipad railing, his chest heaving. Alara moved to him, her presence an absolute anchor. She didn't say a word. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. The masks were gone. The building was silent. Above them, the sirens of the police choppers were rising. But for the first time in 15 years, the air didn't taste like ozone and secrets. It tasted like the truth. The morning light was a pale, clean gold, washing away the cold blue nightmare of the night before. Thorn Tower stood tall, a scarred monolith of glass and steel, but the atmosphere inside was no longer one of clinical luxury or silver-tongued betrayals. It was a place of restoration. Julian sat in his executive chair, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He had traded his torn tuxedo for a fresh charcoal suit, though a bandage peeked from beneath his collar, a permanent reminder of the price of the truth. On his desk lay the decrypted ledger, the evidence that had finally cleared his father's name and sent the remnants of the Volkov Empire into the light of a courtroom. A soft, rhythmic knock sounded at the door. Not the frantic, clumsy tapping he had grown used to over the last 3 years, but a steady, confident beat. Alara stepped inside. She wasn't wearing an oversized cardigan or thick-rimmed glasses. She wore a tailored black dress that mirrored Julian's own quiet strength, her hair pulled back to reveal the expressive eyes that no longer needed to hide. She moved with a liquid grace that filled the room, a predator who had finally found her territory. "You're late, Alara," Julian remarked, his voice a low, resonant scrape. But this time, he was looking directly at her, his gray eyes burning with an intense, forward-facing warmth. "I had to drop off my resignation," she said, placing a single sheet of paper on his desk. She leaned against the mahogany, her posture mirroring his lethal confidence. The assistant was a bit of a klutz. "I don't think she's coming back." Julian stood, his presence an absolute anchor as he walked around the desk. He didn't stop until he was in her personal space, the dangerous thrill of their shared history vibrating between them. He reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her waist, drawing her into the heat of his presence. "Good," he whispered, his voice dropping to a melodic anchor. "I had a different role in mind anyway." He picked up a new folder from the desk. It wasn't a firing notice or a legal warning. It was a partnership agreement, Thorn Advanced Security and Acquisitions. At the bottom, his signature was already dry. "I spent 15 years hunting a ghost because I thought she was my enemy," Julian said, his gaze searching hers with a raw, shared vulnerability. "I didn't realize she was the only person in this city who actually knew me. I don't want a shadow, Alara. I want a queen who can see the threats I miss. Alara looked at the contract, then back at the man who had become her shield. The gilded cage of her double life was gone, replaced by a life of her own making. She reached out, her fingers brushing the scar on his eyebrow before she took the pen. It's a high price, Mr. Thorne, she teased, her voice a low thread of silk. I require full access to the vault, my own security clearance, and a very specific type of health insurance. And what's that? The kind where you never go into a burning building without me again, she replied, her grip on his hand instinctive and fierce. Julian leaned in, his forehead resting against hers as the city hummed to life below them. The masks were destroyed, the ghosts were laid to rest, and the hunter had finally stopped running. He didn't just have a partner, he had a home. Accepted, he murmured, before sealing the contract with a kiss that tasted of dawn and finality. The ghost of Thorn Tower was gone, but Alara Vance had never been more visible.